By 6 o'clock on the evening of April 11, 1966, the American perimeter inside the Courtenay Rubber Plantation had contracted to roughly 40 yards across, about half the ground it had held when the fighting began. Charlie Company's 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry, had walked into that jungle with 134 men. Its commander was wounded. Every one of its platoon leaders was dead or hit. The relief column had stopped for the night. The senior officer still functioning was a 23-year-old lieutenant who had inherited command by attrition, and his answer to being overrun was to call American artillery onto the ground just outside his own position and keep it falling until dawn. When Bravo Company walked in at 7:15 the next morning, 106 of the 134 men who had gone into that jungle were dead or wounded. Their own division had put them out there as bait. Charlie Company was not an elite formation and was never meant to be one. It was a standard rifle company in a standard infantry battalion in the most heavily committed American division in South Vietnam. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one, had begun arriving in July 1965, its 2nd Brigade shipping out as the vanguard that June, and by April 1966 the division held a sprawling area of responsibility across 3rd Corps, the provinces surrounding Saigon. The 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry, carried a regimental lineage running back through Omaha Beach and Yangon. The men filling its ranks carried nothing of the sort. They were draftees and short-term volunteers, most of them between 18 and 22, trained at Fort Riley in Kansas and shipped across the Pacific by troopship. Within the battalion they were the Rangers, a nickname of tradition rather than qualification. The company's paper strength was around 290 men. On April 10, 1966, it could put 134 into the field. The rest were in the rear, in hospital, on leave, or simply gone, absorbed by the ordinary arithmetic of a unit that had been fighting since the previous summer without a replacement pipeline able to keep pace. A rifle company at under half strength was not considered remarkable in 1966. It was considered normal, and that assumption would matter enormously within 36 hours. The officers reflected the improvised quality of the whole enterprise. Captain William Nolan commanded the company. A Citadel graduate of about 28, quiet and newly arrived in Vietnam, he had not yet taken a company through a major engagement, and neither had his executive officer, Lieutenant Kenneth Alderson. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel William Hathaway, had thought it necessary to tell Nolan explicitly to listen to the men who had been in country longer. First Lieutenant John Libbs, 23, had led 2nd Platoon since arriving in June 1965, and had seen more combat than any other platoon leader in the company. Lieutenant Martin Crower, 30, led 3rd Platoon after 9 years as an enlisted paratrooper and a commission in 1962. Lieutenant George Steinberg had 4th Platoon. 2nd Lieutenant Smith DeVoe had 1st Platoon and had been in the country a matter of weeks. Attached to the command group was 1st Lieutenant Francis Fox, the artillery forward observer, whose radio was the company's link to its supporting guns. Their mission was the one every American infantry company in 3rd Corps was given that spring, and its logic reached far above the level of the men carrying it out. General William Westmoreland's command had concluded that the war would be won through attrition by locating communist main force units and destroying them faster than they could be replaced. The difficulty was arithmetic running in the other direction. American units could not find an enemy that declined to be found. Search and destroy operations swept enormous areas of jungle for days and produced heat casualties and abandoned campsites. It left commanders with a persistent problem: overwhelming firepower and no reliable way to bring it to bear. In March 1966, command of the 1st Infantry Division passed from Major General Jonathan Seaman to Major General William DePuy, and the division's approach to that problem changed accordingly. DePuy was physically slight, intellectually formidable, and without patience for officers he judged inadequate. He had commanded an infantry battalion in Europe at 25, and watched his division bleed itself white in Normandy through what he considered incompetent leadership, an experience that shaped every command decision he made afterwards. Before taking the division, he had been Westmoreland's operations officer at Military Assistance Command Vietnam, which meant he had spent a year designing the attrition strategy at theater level before being handed a division to execute it. His tactical formula was blunt and often repeated. Locate the enemy with as few men as possible, then bury him under bombs, shells, and napalm until the other side gave up. Applied to the jungles of 3 corps, this meant infantry existed principally to make contact, and artillery and air power existed to do the actual killing. The division would eventually codify the sequence in its own battle principles, published the following year, which assigned infantry, armor, and aviation the job of finding the enemy, and assigned the artillery the job of killing him. It was a reasonable answer to a genuine problem, and it produced a doctrine in which small units were expected to find a much larger enemy and then survive long enough for the firepower to arrive. The whole concept rested on one assumption, which was that reinforcement and fire support would reach the fixing element in time. That assumption held more often than not. When it failed catastrophically. Operation Abilene began on March 29, 1966, and its object reached beyond the province it was fought in. Westmoreland expected Phuoc Chu to serve as a staging area for a summer offensive against Saigon, and Abilene was designed to disrupt that before it started. The named targets were the Viet Cong 274th and 275th Regiments of the 5th Division, and their base areas in the Mae Tao Secret Zone, a stretch of dense country southeast of Saigon that had been under communist control for years. 2 brigades of the 1st Infantry Division took part, with the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, and the 161st Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery, attached. The Australians and New Zealanders were operating in country that would become their own responsibility within weeks, as the 1st Australian Task Force established itself at Nui Dat that June. Around 50 Hueys shuttled troops between clearings for the duration. The intelligence underpinning all of it was wrong in a specific and consequential way. Neither the 274th nor the 275th Regiment was in Phuoc Tuy when the operation began. 2 American brigades spent the better part of a fortnight sweeping a province for 2 regiments that had already left it, and the contact they made was correspondingly thin. Every base camp the Americans found was empty except one. This was not a failure of execution, but the expected outcome of maneuvering large formations against an opponent who could hear helicopters 20 minutes out. By the second week of April, Abilene had produced a great deal of walking and very little fighting, and the pressure on DePuy to generate results was considerable. The method the 2nd Battalion used to find that fight has been argued over ever since, and the argument turns on a single word. According to the historian Andrew Woods, Hathaway was instructed to entice the enemy into attacking his companies by isolating them from mutual support. On March 30th, the battalion was airlifted into Landing Zone Norman on the Courtenay Rubber Plantation, broken into its component rifle companies, and sent out separately into the jungle. Battery A of the 1st Battalion, 7th Artillery, followed to provide the firepower that was supposed to destroy whatever took the offer. No company was formally labeled the bait, and DePuy would later insist, in a private letter written to Libs in 1988, that the only occasion on which he deliberately dangled a unit was the Mintown Road ambush that July. That operation had a designated decoy, a prepared reaction force, and deliberately leaked information to draw the enemy in. Abilene had none of those things. What it had was a battalion dispersed in a pattern its planners hoped would invite attack, which is the same effect arrived at by a less deliberate route. The spacing is where the theory came apart. Standing instructions called for companies to patrol with roughly 660 yards between them. The 2nd Brigade's own practice in earlier operations had been closer, around 440 yards. When the fighting started, Bravo Company was about 1,100 yards from Charlie Company, and some accounts put the gap at closer to 1.25 miles. In open country, the difference would have been academic. In triple canopy jungle, where a company cutting a single-file trail could manage roughly 100 yards an hour, it was the difference between support and spectatorship. On the evening of April 10th, Easter Sunday, the company halted in a clearing to receive a chaplain and hold Easter services. Earlier that day, it had killed a Viet Cong scout, and documents taken from the dead suggested men of the 274th Regiment were in the area. DePuy flew in by helicopter that evening, marked in by green smoke, spoke with Fox about artillery support, and told the assembled officers that the dead scout confirmed other intelligence placing the D-800 battalion nearby. D-800 was a main force unit of roughly 400 men and a component of the 5th Viet Cong Division. Then he flew out. Libs noted at the time that a general's helicopter arriving and departing had almost certainly advertised their position. The conditions the company would operate in the next morning deserve to be stated precisely, because they determined everything that followed. The plantation and the jungle around it lay roughly 40 miles east of Saigon, between the capital and the South China Sea, with the 2nd Brigade base camp at Bearcat well to the west. Visibility on the ground was frequently under 20 yards. No clearing nearby was large enough to land a helicopter, which ruled out air assault reinforcement and conventional medical evacuation. Artillery came from a single battery of 105mm howitzers. The nearest friendly rifle company was over half a mile away through jungle that permitted 100 yards of progress an hour. And the company's own strength stood at 134 against an enemy battalion estimated at 3 times that number. Charlie Company moved out at 7:30 on the morning of April 11th, Easter Monday. Crower's 3rd platoon took point, a decision Crower privately considered unfair, though he understood the reasoning. Nolan wanted his 2 experienced platoon leaders at the front and rear, with Libs on drag. Steinberg's 4th platoon followed the point, then DeVoe's 1st platoon, with the command group in the middle. The company moved in a formation called platoon line, squads in column, which put each platoon's squads into several parallel columns rather than one long snake, and which was intended to keep the subunits mutually supporting. A rifle company moving through jungle of that density is less a formation than a set of separate elements connected by radio. Men lost sight of the soldier ahead of them. Platoons had no visual contact with one another. Command was exercised entirely through the handset of a PRC-25, which is workable until several platoons need to move simultaneously in relation to a threat none of them can see. The morning produced a steady accumulation of small indicators. Around 9:30, the company came across empty trenches. At 11, the point squad halted, and the axis of advance swung west. The company had been finding well-used trails since it entered the plantation, and the platoon sergeants had been telling Nolan for 2 days that the signs on those trails were fresh. At noon, the company stopped for sea rations. 15 minutes later, Crower reported contact. What followed over the next 20 minutes is the hinge of the battle. Nolan ordered a patrol forward. 5 minutes out, a sniper put a round through a soldier's shoulder, the company's first casualty of the day. Crower's radio operator fired at figures who seemed to drop straight into the ground, which on flat terrain meant a bunker or a tunnel. Crower passed this back and gave his assessment. The enemy was either delaying the company or pulling it away from something. Nolan asked what he thought they should do. Crower told him to find out where they were going. By 12:25, there was firing at both the front and the rear of the column. That decision is worth sitting with, because it is not obviously wrong. Sporadic sniping was the ordinary texture of operations in that province, and a commander who halted at every exchange of shots would not remain a commander long under DePuy. A squad from Alpha Company had been ambushed in the same fashion the previous day, losing 1 man killed and a platoon leader badly wounded, and the enemy had then vanished. The pattern Charlie Company was taking was consistent with harassment. It was equally consistent with a larger unit fixing an opponent in place while it maneuvered around him, and from inside the undergrowth there was no way to tell the difference. Alderson's private reservation was not about pressing forward, but about standing still. He believed a stationary company gave the enemy time to organize, and Charlie Company stayed in roughly the same place for a long while as Crower's patrols probed. What no one in the company knew was that the trail they had been working ran east to west directly toward the D-800 Battalion's base camp, and that the column had come to a halt roughly 150 yards from its entrance. Behind a screen of vines and bamboo, at the edge of that camp, were trenches with 2 heavy machine guns already sighted. The tactical situation collapsed with remarkable speed. Snipers were in the trees, which in triple canopy jungle is a decisive advantage, since a man lying prone is protected against ground fire and mortar fragments and completely exposed from above. Riflemen in khaki were observed among those in black, an indication to experienced soldiers that regular officers were directing the action. Libs, from the rear, radioed Nolan to pull the company into a circle, and he did not phrase it politely. The order was correct. Executing it was another matter, because a rifle company in jungle cannot contract quickly, and every man who moved drew fire from above. Then came the artillery, and it is here that the engagement turned from serious to catastrophic. Crower, forward with his platoon, could see no more than 10 yards to his front. He located what he judged to be the source of the heaviest fire by ear, which is a matter of educated guesswork, and called a fire mission through Fox on the PRC-25. The first ranging round landed well out. Crower asked for a 50-yard adjustment. The second went right. The third went further out still. He corrected again by dead reckoning, judged the fourth close enough, and ordered 10 rounds for effect. 2 of those rounds came down inside his own platoon. The shells burst in the trees, which in jungle is the worst possible outcome, since the canopy converts a ground-burst weapon into an air-burst and throws wood splinters as well as steel. One report put the immediate cost at 5 killed and roughly a dozen wounded, though with sniper fire arriving simultaneously, nobody could establish which casualties came from which source. The barrage stopped at 1:45. The consequence was more serious than the casualties. DePuy informed that the supporting battery had fired into an American company suspended artillery support. For a critical interval, Charlie Company had no artillery at all, which was the only asset the entire doctrine depended on, and the enemy used the pause to close to distances at which artillery became difficult to employ. Nobody at battalion or division called for infantry reinforcement during that window either. The company had lost its firepower and had not yet been given anything in its place. Nolan, receiving fragmentary casualty reports from every direction, conferred with Alderson and decided to break out, sending 2 squads drawn from 1st and 2nd platoons at the sector under the lightest fire. The attempt failed. So did the ones that followed. By early afternoon, the hostile fire had spread around the whole position, and by 3 o'clock the company had stabilized into something resembling a perimeter, which is to say it had stopped trying to go anywhere. The medical evacuation that followed brought the battle its most enduring figure. The Army's call for help reached the Air Force around 3 o'clock. Pararescue helicopters worked in pairs, so 2 Kaman HH-43F Huskies, call signs Pedro 73 and Pedro 97, flew to the site. The troopers had cut a hole in the canopy large enough for an aircraft to hover about 100 feet above the jungle floor and lower a Stokes litter, a metal-framed basket, through the gap. The first lift took 45 minutes to move 3 wounded men because nobody on the ground had been trained to control a swinging basket, and the litters kept fouling on the way into the cabin. Airman First Class William Pitzenbarger, a 21-year-old pararescueman from Piqua, Ohio, rode the cable down to fix that problem. He rigged the litters, treated wounded men, and organized the lifts. Pedro 73 was on its 6th run when ground fire hit it. The order came for Pitzenbarger to take the hoist up. He waved it off and stayed. It was his own decision, made with a clear view of the ground situation, and nothing in his role required it. The company's condition through the late afternoon can be summarized in a few figures. Its command structure was gone. Nolan wounded, Alderson wounded, all 4 platoon leaders killed or hit, and the platoon sergeants killed, wounded, or pinned. The enemy had emplaced machine guns around the perimeter, including .51 caliber Chinese-made heavy weapons whose rounds passed through trees, logs, and men without appreciable loss of velocity. Ammunition, water, morphine, and dressings were running out. The perimeter had contracted from roughly 80 yards across to around 40. Relief remained over half a mile away in jungle that permitted 100 yards of progress an hour. Resupply came down from a single Army helicopter, kicking ammunition cases out of its door, which under heavy fire signaled that it would have to leave before the load was complete. Crower radioed the pilot that if the ammunition did not come down, the aircraft was not leaving either. He stayed until the last case went out. Several breakout attempts were made through the afternoon and early evening from more than one sector of the perimeter. All of them ran into concentrated fire within yards of the lines. After that, the company had no options left except to hold ground and keep artillery falling, which meant that the decision made at division to suspend the guns after the short rounds had to be reversed, and was. What kept the company alive was Major Bibb Underwood, the battalion executive officer, who spent the afternoon and the entire night in a helicopter above the fight, relaying between the company and headquarters, adjusting fire, and switching aircraft when his fuel ran low. Underwood said afterwards that part of his purpose was simply to let the men below know somebody up there was still connected to the outside world. That was not a small thing. Charlie Company had lost the ability to maneuver, to evacuate, or to be reinforced. What it retained was a voice on the radio and a battery of howitzers. The individual actions that produced the battle's decorations occurred in this phase, and they illustrate what the fight had become. Sergeant James Robinson, a fireteam leader in 1st Platoon and one of 2 former Marines in the company, went outside the perimeter repeatedly to bring in wounded men, was hit while doing it, and kept going. He used an M79 grenade launcher against the snipers in the trees. Out of rifle ammunition and wounded twice, he took 2 grenades and moved on a heavy machine gun that had been raking his platoon's sector, destroyed it, and was killed. He received the Medal of Honor, the 10th awarded to a member of the 16th Infantry Regiment. Steinberg, whose 4th platoon was down to a dozen effective men, was severely wounded early and kept his platoon fighting until the enemy assault on his front was broken. He was killed leading a charge and received the Distinguished Service Cross. Pitzenbarger, having exhausted his medical supplies, spent the afternoon doing what the infantry around him were doing. He moved through the perimeter gathering weapons and ammunition from the dead and wounded and redistributing them, dragged casualties into cover, and at one point pulled 2 American bodies over a badly bleeding sergeant to shield him from fire. He picked up a rifle and joined the firing. He was killed at some point during the evening. His body was found the following morning by a sergeant looking for friends, identifiable at first only by the Air Force insignia on fatigues noticeably cleaner than anyone else's. By full dark, the situation had passed beyond anything command decisions could influence. Fire slackened, and survivors could hear movement all around them, in the trees and on the ground. Amplified voices came through megaphones from more than one side of the perimeter. Parties moved among the casualties lying outside the shrunken lines, stripping weapons and ammunition from the dead and from men who were playing dead. Crower, badly wounded and lying outside the perimeter with his radio operator and a medic, survived that period by remaining motionless while his rifle was lifted from beside him. The medic next to him moved and was shot. Inside the perimeter, Libbs took command. He was not the senior man by any table of organization, but he was functional and reachable, and Alderson was out of contact. He told the men around him, in substance, that they were not going to get out of this and should fire at anything that moved. Then he worked the radio. The critical exchange came at just before 6 in the evening, when the enemy massed for what the survivors read as a final assault. Libbs, DeVoe, and Fox had already discussed bringing the artillery directly onto their own position. Libbs asked Underwood for the guns closer, judged the first volley too far out, and asked for closer still. Underwood, working from a map on his lap in the helicopter, sent down new coordinates, and high explosive came down within a few dozen yards of American soldiers lying flat on the ground. The massing attack did not arrive. According to the supporting artillery battalion's own report on the battle, that was the moment the assault was broken, and the fire continued at intervals through the night, with flares overhead. Accounts of the total expenditure vary, and the figure most often repeated is around 1,100 rounds. There is no delicate way to describe what that meant. The company survived by accepting a significant probability of being killed by its own guns in exchange for a certainty of being killed if the guns stopped. The same weapon that had opened the disaster at 1:45 closed it after dark. The choice was made by a 23-year-old lieutenant in his second year of service, and it was the correct one. The relief that did not come is its own piece of the story. Bravo Company had been moving toward Charlie Company since the afternoon, cutting its way forward and later navigating by the sound of the artillery. It halted at sunset. The decision came from Battalion headquarters, on the reasonable ground that a company approaching a shot-up perimeter in darkness was likely to be fired on by the men inside it. The effect of that decision, whatever its logic, was to leave Charlie Company defended by artillery alone until daylight. Bravo resumed at first light, entered the deserted enemy base camp, accompanied by Hathaway and the battalion operations officer, and linked up with the survivors at 7:15 on April 12th. A single shot fired minutes earlier had briefly convinced the men in the perimeter that a dawn assault was starting. There was still nowhere to land. Air Force pararescue men came down cables. Helicopters put engineers into the jungle with chainsaws, and only once they had cut a landing zone large enough for a Chinook could the dead and wounded be flown out. The enemy had broken contact before the relief arrived. The accounting is contested in its specifics and unambiguous in aggregate. On the morning of April 12th, 35 Americans were dead, the equivalent of an entire platoon. The final roll of the fallen from that action runs to 37 names, including Pitzenbarger, the one man on it who was not in the army. Around 70 were wounded. The most commonly cited total is 106 casualties out of 134 men, a rate of 80%, and 28 men came out of the plantation unhurt. Enemy losses were reported at 41 bodies left on the field. Hathaway's after-action report estimated at least 150 enemy dead, a figure the regimental history itself notes is probably too high. And the official history of the 5th Viet Cong Division puts its own loss at 41, which is exactly the number the Americans counted on the ground. Westmoreland's memoir, published years later, described the action in a single paragraph and put the American dead at 48, which is wrong by 11. But a theater commander's own published account overstated the loss of a company he had been briefed on is a useful measure of how thin the institutional memory of small unit actions became. By the metric American commanders were using in 1966, the exchange was defensible. That was the metric, and this is the case that exposes its limits with unusual clarity. Charlie Company had, in the narrow sense, done what was asked of it. D-800 had been brought to battle, had failed to overrun an American rifle company at odds of 3-1, and had taken losses it could not easily replace. The company received the Valorous Unit Award, approved by the Secretary of the Army on April 23, 1968. But the operational purpose of an isolated company was to fix the enemy long enough for the rest of the battalion to arrive and destroy him, and that never happened. Bravo Company reached the fight 19 hours after the first shot and hours after the last one. The jungle, assessed beforehand as an obstacle, turned out to be the decisive terrain feature of the engagement. DePuy landed at the newly cut landing zone that morning. Alderson, briefing him, said the company had been ambushed from the trees and did not blame the plan. Libbs, sitting against a tree, declined to stand when the general's aide told him to. DePuy dismissed the aide, sat down beside the lieutenant, and asked what had happened. Libbs told him the company had been put out there as bait and walked into a slaughter. By the account Libbs gave George Wilson 2 decades later, DePuy's answer was that there was no other way to start a fight. Whatever else it was an honest summary of American operational thinking in 3 cores in 1966, delivered in the middle of the evidence. The formal analysis reached the same conclusion by a longer route. A battalion staff officer named Robert Ward, who had worked on the after-action report, later wrote a lessons learned piece for Infantry magazine, arguing that companies within a battalion should be mutually supporting no more than an hour apart, even under the worst conditions. Alderson thought that single sentence explained the outcome better than anything else written about the battle. The company had not been destroyed by a superior enemy so much as by a distance. More than 20 years afterwards, in the same letter in which he rejected the word bait, DePuy acknowledged that the companies had been too far apart. The lesson was absorbed operationally within weeks. On the Mintang Road that July, the division ran a deliberate version of the same idea with a designated decoy, a reaction force positioned close enough to matter and information leaked to draw the enemy in. It worked. The tactical concept was never abandoned. Only the margins were adjusted. The wider reckoning arrived quickly and from the top. Army Chief of Staff Harold Johnson, who already had doubts about Westmoreland's strategy, flew to Vietnam after the battle specifically to confront DePuy and warned him that American public support would not survive many more days like Charlie Company's. That warning was delivered in April 1966, before Attleboro, before Junction City, before the Tet Offensive, and it identified the war's actual center of gravity with 2 years to spare. Nobody acted on it, because no available strategy produced results without producing casualties at that rate. What happened to the men is harder to compress. Nolan, Alderson, Libbs, Crower, and DeVoe all survived. Steinberg did not. The wounded were scattered through hospitals in Vietnam, Japan, and the United States, and the company was rebuilt around a handful of survivors and a flood of replacements, which meant the unit that fought at Xa Cam My effectively ceased to exist within weeks. By the summer, the men who had held that perimeter were the old hands, and everyone around them was new. One sergeant who had frozen during the fight went back on patrol afterwards, did his duty, and drowned crossing a river that June. Robinson's Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously. Pitsenbarger's took 34 years. He received the Air Force Cross in 1966, and not until December 2000, after a sustained campaign in which veterans of the company he had chosen to stay with were central, was the award upgraded and presented to his parents. That story, rather than the battle itself, is what eventually reached a wide audience through the 2019 film The Last Full Measure. The men of Charlie Company were, by every ordinary measure, unremarkable. Young, mostly conscripted, indifferently trained by the standards of units that came later, equipped with rifles many of them did not entirely trust. They were sent into a place their commanders knew was dangerous, and when the trap closed, they did not break. Surrounded, cut off, hit by their own artillery, with every officer down and no prospect of relief before morning, a company at under half strength held its perimeter for 18 hours against a battalion 3 times its size and denied that battalion what it had come for. Command passed downward as men fell, from captain to lieutenant to sergeant, and it kept functioning at every level. Robinson's charge, Steinberg's stand, and Pitsenbarger's refusal to be lifted out have decorations attached to them. The conduct they represent was general across that perimeter, in men whose names appear nowhere but the roll of the fallen and a wall in Washington. Xa Cam My has never entered American public memory the way Ia Drang or Hamburger Hill did. It was one company, in one afternoon and one night, in a province most Americans could not name, during a month when the war still looked manageable. It survives in the regimental histories, in a chapter of George Wilson's book, in a full-length study by Tracy Dirks, built from interviews with the men who were there, and in the recollections of survivors who spent decades arguing that an airman who chose to stay deserved better than the nation's second highest award. The battle changed no policy and produced no strategic consequence. What it produced was an early, precise demonstration of the gap between a doctrine that assumed reinforcement would arrive and terrain in which it could not.